A very good morning to you. It's a Friday edition of Business Morning, and we're glad to have you. I am BC Adebayo. Things are looking bright at the crude oil market today as Brent crude touches $32 per barrel, following data showing demand for crude picking up in China. Brent crude was up 3.57% at $32.24 a barrel earlier on, after rising nearly 7% on Thursday. The global benchmark is on course for a 1.8 gain this week. WTI oil was also up 3.23% at $28.45 a barrel, having jumped 9% in the previous session. WTI is heading for a third weekly increase, and that's up more than 12%. Amid supply cuts now by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and other major producers, bright spots are also emerging on the demand side. And data released today show that China's daily crude oil use rebounded in April as refineries ramped up operations. The manufacturing sector in Africa has been taking a thorough beating since the outbreak of COVID-19 in the continent. This is reflective of its Purchasing Managers' Indices for April 2020, which slides below the 50-point threshold, and that indicates a contraction. Analysts at United Capital have attributed the decline to contractions in South Africa's PMI, which came in at 46.1, Egypt at 29.7, Kenya 37.3, and Nigeria at 37.1 as at March 2020. The head of research analysts at the United Capital, Wale Olusi, joins us now for this conversation. Good morning, Wale. Thanks for joining us on the program. Now, bring us up to speed about the realities of COVID-19 across the African markets.
Good morning, BC. Thank you for having me. Just like you said, what we tried to track was the PMI indicators as published by Stanbic and Market Index across Africa to see what is actually happening to business and manufacturing activities across the region. And what we noticed was that compared to an average of over 50 from January to March in 2020, there was a sharp drop in PMI index or indices in key economies of Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, and Egypt across Africa. I think it's important to note that the Purchasing Managers Index is a leading indicator as to what the economy will do in a particular quarter. It simply measures what is happening to purchasing activities of suppliers, of manufacturers, their employment level, their inventory level, as well as a few other indicators. For example, in Nigeria, the last time we had a PMI index below 50 was between 2016 and 2017, and that was when we recorded a recession. Now, from what Stanbic Market Index is saying, the CBN PMI index is slightly different. But as at February, March, we have also noticed a sharp drop in those indices. Now, if the central bank's PMI index comes out, and it also matches what Stanbic is saying, if you put those two numbers together, what that is telling you is that in Nigeria, as well as across Africa, we might be seeing what everybody has been talking about in terms of GDP contraction across the region, because an index level for PMI below 50 actually means that economic activities is contracting.
Oh, how does this affect the manufacturing sector's sizable contribution of 11% to sub-Saharan Africa's GDP?
Well, what that simply means is that what you have around employment levels as well as inventory levels across Africa. It means that production levels are slower in the month of April. It means that the amount of new orders that manufacturers ask for, they are lower. It also means that suppliers' delivery time is probably longer because of the various lockdown and restrictions on movement. And then raw material inventory are probably on the high because they are not being used up as frequently as they were in the previous month. So, it simply means that what we used to have in terms of manufacturing activities in the prior months. They are not happening as fast. And the key sectors that we look at when we talk about PMI manufacturing industries or sectors include the likes of cement, food and beverages, printing, electrical supplies, and so on. Painting, chemical, and all that, petroleum coating, all those kind of industries. It simply means that because a lot of people were ordered back home to stay back at home. The last time we had this conversation, BC, you remember we were talking about the fact that President Buhari extended lockdown in Nigeria. And then we were telling ourselves then that, for those in the services sector, some of them can actually work from home. But for those who have to be in the factory to monitor what the machines are doing and put quality control measures in place, they might not be able to work from home. And that is what the PMI numbers is basically reflecting.
But what subsectors under the manufacturing market are actually the worst hit now?
Well, from what we are seeing, it looks like those that are not directly involved in food and beverages are the most hit. Remember, these are the sectors that are food is basically one of the sectors that was classified among the essential sectors. Somehow they were allowed to continue to work during the period. They have a pass, for example, in Nigeria, alongside a Greek. But the non-food manufacturing sectors, probably such as cement, chemical and paint, printing, rubber processing, and so on. These sectors are, heavily affected because, including woodwork and carpentry and all that, many of them actually shut down fully for the 5 weeks period in Nigeria, and I think across Africa before the recent easing of restriction of movement and economic activities that we started seeing about a week or two ago resumed.
What about sectors that are seen to be immune from the effects of COVID-19, like pharmaceuticals and medical items manufacturers?
Well, for some of those sectors, actually, in the indices captured in Nigeria, for example, I'm not sure healthcare is actually there, but from what we've seen, it is clear that the likes of pharmaceutical, healthcare supplies, healthcare equipment, all those companies making production of PPE equipment for medical personnel, including healthcare as a whole. Telecom services also in the services sector. I also need to state that apart from the manufacturing sector, there's also a PMI for non-manufacturing sector. Those ones are not as affected because those in the services sector would find a way to continue to, perform their activity, including the banks. These guys did not feel the impact as much as the guys in the manufacturing sector during this period, and I think the PMI indicator for them was, slightly better than the manufacturing sector. They saw, unlike a jump in employment level, for example, in the previous months, there was a complete slowdown in that activity for them, and their production level was more or less flat or a marginal decline across some of these regions.
Now, how should governments across Africa, and particularly Nigeria, actually respond to the state of the manufacturing sector in view of this crisis?
Well, I think what we are beginning to see, if I take Nigeria, for example, is a situation whereby the supply chain issues that the coronavirus outbreak has brought about, especially as it relates to China, is a situation whereby policymakers across this region are now beginning to look inward to avoid the same mistake whereby you have an overexposure to a single country. For example, you will recall that in the course of the lockdown, Central Bank came out with a short, medium to long-term plan in a bid to rescue the Nigerian manufacturing sector. Most of these projections are basically looking at how to substitute, some of the items that we typically import for local manufacturing in a way that it will boost manufacturing activities across the region. Like you mentioned earlier, we noted that about 11% of the GDP is contributed by the manufacturing sector. Now, if what the CBN wants to do in Nigeria, for example, works, what we will be importing majorly will be heavy machineries that can support production of all those many items that we else before now import from China. The only problem, however, will be the efficiency of that process. How efficiently can we produce those things compared to the Chinese? How much investments have we made in the ability to actually produce those things in a competitive manner, in a way that people will not continue to look out to compare, if I import this thing compared to if I buy it locally, which one is more profitable? Because wholesalers and distributors are, at the end of the day, even manufacturers, are about how much profits will they make. So if we can do that competitively, then the future looks, bright for the manufacturing sector, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa.
Head of Research at United Capital, Wale Olusu, thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced religious organizations to shut their doors physically in a bid to curb the spread. While quite a number of faith-based organizations have resorted to technology to conduct services, attendance has been dismal and their financials badly affected as a result of lower inflows, which usually support ministers in staff salaries, as well as church utility costs and other expenses. Well, joining us now to examine this development is an economist and business development consultant, Gospel Obele, who's here with us in the studio. Good morning and thanks for coming on the program. Now, let's begin with you telling us how religion actually connects to the economy.
So in the real sense of it, when you want to look at it in terms of impact, we want to use the word religion. It would now be based on the beliefs and how much they are relevant, how they see themselves as relevant in the society. So yes, it's very important as regards closing gaps that maybe the government may not be able to close, in terms of social impact and responsible citizenry and the likes, yeah.
And so how challenging would you say this period of COVID-19 pandemic has actually been for faith-based organizations?
Well, yes, it's been very challenging. You know that they hold a critical chunk of the populace, basically, and people have to gather en masse, to have something going up right there. And because COVID-19 hits at the center of all of these things, it has grossly affected fiscal representation in the cathedrals, in the buildings, and also finances, and even engagement, more importantly. Yeah.
But in spite of their strategic leverage of technology, the finances have been badly affected, and that's due to the lockdown effects compounded by low tithes and offerings across denominations. Now, what has your research told you about this?
So we discovered that the challenge is a lot more deeper than it seems. Religious institutions over time have just believed that, the economy works in a particular way, and there seems to be a form of training capacity in that space also, an inability to look into global uncertainties and how the economics of the world right now impacts what they're doing. So in that sense, and looking at that training capacity angle also, you find out that there's an engagement gap. So the churches or institutions need a physical representation of individuals to be liquid, or to be able to raise a particular amount of money, or to stay financially afloat and all that. So now that you don't have that, there's a question around how finances are coming in and how they are being able to keep up with the operational expenses. Now, the reason why you can't do that, you can't duplicate that when you now have online services and use of technology, is because of the engagement gap. So our research revealed that 50% of individuals who even attend churches do not worship with their home church online. So it will now be that when the lockdowns and all of those things, or when large gatherings are being lifted, restrictions on large gatherings are being lifted, people can maybe go back to the church, but then there will be a form of transplanting, because the season has made people realize a few other things that they've never seen before. So the engagement gap is the reason why you have that shortfall in online engagement. So you can't have that finance conversion online because you did not engage appropriately physically. Yeah.
What about the cost of data on these online services? Could that possibly also be a reason for the low turnout online?
So yes, there's a cost of data conversation to it, but that's not the major reason, because there are also religious institutions that have been able to cut it through. You know, I track a lot of religious institutions on Sunday mornings, and I realize that very few are also getting some level of onboarding, as it were. So people have realized that, oh, I can affiliate myself to this because of these particular things, and this lockdown has revealed that to me, you know, and a lot of other interesting dynamics like that beyond just data. And also looking at the economies of scale, you know, some institutions are empowered way more than others. So that ability to make the most of television networks and the likes has also increased in quote engagement, but it has not translated completely to finance.
Let's talk about inflows to banks now. Churches make, a huge contribution to that. What's your impact assessment of the absence of tithes and offerings, for instance, on the bank's balance sheets?
Yeah, so largely there's been a huge drop. Week on week, you find out that they make a critical chunk of bank deposits, right? And because that culture has been tied to a physical representation of a number of individuals for them to stay liquid and continue in that order, COVID-19 has disrupted that now. So there's been a great drop in the number of deposits that churches are being able to make into banks. And what we discovered that also banks will also find a way to work around it, because it's not sustainable for them primarily. And then you have a situation where the churches are finding or thinking of newer ways to raise finance. But it seems like it's too late. But it's also a learning curve for them, because they have to think of creative ways to be more financially afloat beyond tithes and offerings.
I'm talking about creative ways to be more financially afloat. Now, many of these faith-based organizations also have investments in the education sector. Of course, nobody foresaw that COVID-19 will keep the churches and the schools closed. So how does this actually affect such investments?
So very few in that regard. So just to put it out clear that this challenge is global, number one, and then it cuts across every sector, not just faith-based organizations. But if you look at it very well, very few have the capacity to even engage at that level, right? And there are also conversations around signatories and the likes, but that's not what we want to delve into now. The thing is, churches will have to think of, on post-COVID, how to be more economically impactful, than just, having outfits and the likes that are not sustainable in the medium term. Nobody saw this coming, and it's quite humbling. It's a learning curve for them.
Yeah, so churches definitely won't remain the same post-COVID-19. So what are your forecasts, especially on the financials going forward?
So on the financials, it's going to take a lot of time for churches to recover and for other religious institutions, not because reopening would happen. It would definitely happen in phases, but realize that the question has been more of engagement. And there's been a kind of redistribution in that space. So a church that was probably 1,000 would most likely not be 1,000 on post-COVID. Outside the fact that there will be phased reopenings of churches and the likes, people have come to realize and come to an understanding of deeper things than they ever thought they would arrive at. So I think churches have to think in more creative ways to engage, and because engagement is the most important thing. Because even if you have that phased reopenings and there are temporary lockdowns upfront later, we realize that online engagement is the function of being able to engage appropriately on an economic basis for the individuals and the churches.
Economist and business development consultant Gospel Obele, thanks for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
But we'll be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on climate change in just a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. In the past 2 to 3 months of COVID-19 and lockdown the world over, satellite images representation of coronavirus hotspots has shown a decline in air pollution and greenhouse gases that fuel global warming. Although this may be a positive development for climate change, the question is just how sustainable can this be post-COVID-19? And joining us now for this conversation is the director of the Center for Climate Change and Development at Alex Ekweme Federal University, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke. Good morning, Professor. Thanks for joining us on the program. But can you expatiate on the relationship between climate change and the coronavirus?
Well, thank you for having me. There are a number of different relationships between COVID-19 and climate change. And one of the important similarities or relationships is that both COVID-19 and climate change do not respect national boundaries. We've seen how something that started in Wuhan in China has suddenly spread across the whole world, causing the most unprecedented level of economic harm and death in the whole world. This is very similar to climate change. It does not respect national boundaries. It does not matter where the greenhouse gas emission comes from. The impact is global, is worldwide. The second similarity is that the COVID-19 has shown that any country that refuses to implement long-term planning and move quickly is going to be caught napping, and that the consequences of that will be very devastating. For example, countries like South Korea, Vietnam, that implemented very rapid measures are faring better than the countries like the US that waited for a long time before making any significant policies or implementation. So this is a dire warning that countries that continue to delay to implement substantial climate change measures will end up being left behind in the, I hope, a global green transition that is going to sweep across the country in the next 2 decades. And this is why I worry for my country, Nigeria, because for many, many years, we've squandered the opportunity to diversify our economy, and we've put all our eggs in one basket, as it were, with about 95% of our foreign exchange and from oil. And now the price of oil has plummeted. As at this morning, I think it's about $13 per barrel is the price of crude Brent. And now we are struggling, and we have nowhere to go, nowhere to run to. And the message here is that we must utilize any post-COVID-19 recovery plan to make sure that we are powering our economy towards a green, sustainable development pathway.
So we understand that carbon dioxide emissions have declined lately due to the reduced human mobility, and that's as a result of the lockdown. And this has in turn improved air quality and encouraged even wild animals to come out and explore cities. But how sustainable is this positive development in the long run?
Well, I need to correct, actually, that although we have seen some local improvements in air quality due to decline in vehicular traffic and emission, the latest figures actually coming from the National Agency of Atmospheric Climate Change Observation in Hawaii shows actually that the global carbon emission in April is actually one of the largest in history, with about 416 ppm concentration of CO2. So actually there is nothing to celebrate in terms of the worldwide decline of CO2 emission. And this is because despite the reduction in vehicular emission traffic, actually 64% of our global energy still comes from fossil fuel. And so the reduction that we're seeing in a bit of local air pollution here and there has not translated into any significant change in the global concentration of CO2 emission.
Is it also true that in just 2 months of reduced pollution has saved the lives of some 4,000 children under the age of 5 and 73,000 adults over the age of 70?
Well, even if you were to take that statistic at the face value, you don't want to pay the price of nearly 400,000 deaths globally in order to make that kind of changes or savings in the life of children and global air quality. So this is not something to celebrate at all. This is not the way that we in the IPCC, the UN scientists, have recommended that we should go about saving the world. No, this is not any template at all to be copied. There is nothing to celebrate. In a world that has been locked down, Nigeria, for example, has lost or it is projected that we're going to lose about 90% of our oil, projected oil revenue, about 2 or 3.5 shrinking of the projected GDP for Nigeria. This is not the way to go. What we need to do is to take advantage of what has happened to see that actually life is more important than the economy. Because this is another lesson that we have learned from COVID. We have been shouting many years that we need to move the economy from the exploitative model towards the more sustainable model. And some people thought, well, we are worshiping at the altar of the Homo economicus, that economy trumps all other consideration. But now, COVID-19 has shown that that is not the case, that life is more valuable than the economy. So what we need to do, what the national governments and the global government need to do, is to now say, well, we have seen that the world does not come to an end because the economy has been shut down. And so what we need to do is to rejig our economic calculus and approach in order to make it more sustainable while also addressing climate change. Because if we fail to do that, for example, US is spending about $2.3 trillion in stimulating its economy. If we fail to marry this stimulus or the implementation of this stimulus in a way that will solve global climate change problems, then we actually have squandered the lessons of this COVID. Because in the next 2 decades, we need to bring the global CO2 emission to half of what it is currently. Otherwise, we will miss the target of 1.5 degrees, which the nations have agreed that we need to hit by the end of the century.
Does the 5G network revolution play any role in the COVID-19 casualty argument and in relation to climate change?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
I was asking if the 5G revolution actually plays any role in the COVID-19 casualty argument and how it relates to climate change.
No. I think that is a rubbish conspiracy theory that has no foundation in science. I mean, of course, we have to be clear that the jury is still out about any potential health implications of telecommunication wiring, 2G, 3G, and 4G. But there is absolutely no science anywhere that connects 5G with a coronavirus pandemic. I think that is nonsensical, to be honest. There is absolutely no basis for that kind of assumption.
A professor in the Department of Earth Science at the University of California, Professor Stephen Davis, said in a report that in 2019, some 40 billion tons of CO2 were emitted per $88 billion of the world's GDP with the lockdown effects of COVID-19. Do you actually see that figure dropping this year?
As I already said to you, the latest measurements in the most respected observatory in Hawaii shows that the average concentration of CO2 in the month of April actually was one of the highest in history at about 416 parts per million concentration. I do not think that we can be celebrating now because it is entirely possible that coming out from this lockdown, nations, if they're not careful, will go on and subsidize the same kind of economic activities that have put us in this mess. And that is why we are warning that any stimulus, any recovery plan must be carefully planned and implemented in such a way that it does not exacerbate the problem of climate change. So at the end of the day, it depends on what nations do after the COVID as a way of stimulating their economy. If they spend their monies wisely, then we can see a decline, or we can hope to see a decline in CO2 emissions in the next year. But if they spend the money in an unwise way, for example, $400 billion today is still used to subsidize fossil fuel, compared to just about $102 billion that goes into renewable energy. And so we must make sure that we are switching this kind of use of our money to use the recovery plan to create jobs, to diversify the economy, to spur innovation, to cause our airs to be cleaner, and to move the economy generally into the green transition path. So ultimately, it depends on how we spend our money. Let's talk about Nigeria, for example. You know that gas flaring constitutes about 50 million tons of CO2 emission in Nigeria. And you know also that about 70 to 80% of Nigerian households still cook with three-piece firewood stone. Now, why on earth does it take? It doesn't take any magic. It doesn't take any astronomical knowledge to know that you can convert the gas that you're flaring and use it to power global national innovation and to move this 70 to 80% of the Nigerian household away from cooking with firewood and to cooking with more renewable energy sources. And so we need to be making this sort of transition as we come out of the COVID. Otherwise, we're going to be getting ourselves into the same mess that we were in before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us.
Now, Africa remains vulnerable to climate change. What are some of the lessons for African governments from this pandemic?
Oh, there are many lessons. But I would like to suggest that, as you were talking previously about the figures from the US, you know that an average African still emits about 0.1 tons of carbon dioxide per annum, compared to an average Australian or Canadian or US that is about 25 tons or 20 tons per annum, which means that it takes an Australian, the total amount of emission that an average African emits in 1 year is emitted by an average Australian in 2.3 days. So Africans can use the incidence of this COVID to press hard for debt reduction and for green economy stimulus and package coming from the northern countries. But also, we cannot afford to wait and just expect that these guys are going to dash us tons and tons of money. We need to learn the lessons that if you don't say, here I am, nobody's going to say, there you are. We cannot afford to continue to depend on Western countries for pittance in order to change and transform our economy. Africans need to know that they must invest in innovation. And innovation is the only thing that can help us to overcome this problem. Innovation in clean tech, innovation in agriculture, innovation in fuel efficiency, innovation in transport facilities. For example, we can be blending some of our gas with some kind of gasoline and have alternative transport fuel, which can, of course, reduce emissions, but also ensure that people are getting their petrols in the filling station for a significantly less amount of money than we're paying today. So COVID-19 and climate change offers a number of many opportunities to do things differently. But it is important that African government finds people who knows what they're talking about, who understand the science, who can design and implement policies in a way that will help us to overcome this problem and actually to make profit and boost our economy as a result of this challenge.
Now, that would be a very good point to leave this conversation. Director of the Center of Climate Change and Development at Alex Ekweme Federal University, Professor Chukwu Merije Okereke. Thanks for speaking with us on Business Morning.
Thank you.
And it's time now for our market review with Edidiong Ewang. Good morning, Eddie. So it seems it's been a pretty good week for the markets this week.
Good morning, BC. Well, I wouldn't say a pretty good week, but at least we saw some positive sentiment in the market yesterday, and that was due to demand for Dangote Cement, Nestle, and some lenders. Now, gains from those stocks lifted the all-share index by 0.77% to 23,892.92 points, and the market cap was also higher by 85 billion naira to 12.441 trillion naira. The month-to-date gain increased to 3.8%, while the year-to-date losses moderated to minus 11.0%. Now, total volume of trades increased by 14.8% to 182.74 million units, valued at 2.32 billion naira, and all of that was exchanged in 4,542 deals. Now, Zenith Bank was the most traded stock by volume at 27.28 million units, while GT Bank was the most traded stock by value at 540.71 million naira. Of course, gains from those two lenders and some others lifted the banking index by 1.39%. Nestle was the sole gainer, it single-handedly lifted the consumer goods, and as that stock rose by about 4%, while Dangote Cement was also the sole gainer on the industrial goods counter. Now, some stocks, a couple of insurance stocks like ICO, NEM Insurance, Custodian, and Lancashire declined yesterday, and that dragged the index down by almost 2%. Oil and gas remained unchanged because there was only one gainer on that counter, while the rest were unchanged. But it's the last trading day of the week. Let's talk to Rotimi Fakayejo, a stockbroker, for more. Good morning, Mr. Fakayejo. Thank you for joining us on the program. Okay, I guess we'll have to come back to Mr. Fakayejo. At the unlisted securities market, that segment of the market was unchanged yesterday at 688.51 points, while the market cap also remained at 505.76 billion naira. We saw 15,100 units worth 4.06 million naira traded in 2 deals. Now, moving over to the fixed income market now. The trading in the bond secondary market was bullish as average yield declined by 4 basis points to 10.2%. We saw yields decline across the short, mid, and long end of the curve. We saw 9 deals worth 6.04 billion naira. Good morning, Mr. Fakayejo. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Good morning.
So in absence of any negative event capable of depressing market sentiment, should we expect yesterday's bullish performance to filter into today's trading session, or should we expect the market to close on a bearish note?
Well, I think from what we've seen so far for the week, Monday and Tuesday were closed negative. We saw a sparing positive position on Wednesday, and yesterday was quite very good. And the week-to-date position of the market is about 0.64% negative. With what happened yesterday, at least yesterday we had an increase in volume and value of shares traded. So it's most likely that the bullish trend might extend to today, and that may even translate to the market closing positively for the week.
So I know the market is very unpredictable and things can happen over the weekend, but with what we've seen this week, what is your outlook for next week?
Well, I think so far we've seen the trial for post-lockdown, and we have seen that at least there is enough confidence in the market with respect to what we saw at least the previous week when the market was very, very bullish. And I think for next week, we are likely to see, if they're barring any unforeseen circumstance with respect to pricing, the price of crude oil, which is a very major factor concerning the market. I believe that next week definitely may look out better for the market than this week.
Rotimi Fakayejo, thank you for your input on the program.
Welcome.
So moving over to the Treasury bills markets, at least compared to the bond market, we saw some activity, in the Nigerian Treasury bills market as average yield declined 37 basis points to 2.3%. Yields also declined across the curve. There were about 31 deals worth 15.75 billion naira. In the Omo market, that market was also bullish yesterday as yields contracted by 61 basis points to 8.9%. We saw more of activity on the September 2020 maturity and the March 2021 maturity, but in all, we saw 49 deals worth 79.98 billion naira. Well, let's cross our fingers and hope for a positive trading week. Over to you, BC.
Absolutely, Eddie. We have a few hours more to see if the bullish trend will actually extend till today. Thank you, Eddie Dionga. We'll check out this morning's business headlines in London and look into the debt and currencies market in just a moment. Please stay with us. Let's now travel to London, where Juliana Olayinka is standing by to lead us through today's business headlines. Good morning, Juliana. The Transport for London has secured £1.6 billion in emergency funding to keep tube and bus services running until September. What are the terms of agreement on this bailout?
Good morning, Bissy. Well, the terms are the TfL will be charging Londoners more for their travel once the COVID-19 pandemic is over. After weeks and weeks of pretty tough and public negotiations, last night the TfL did manage to secure this £1.6 billion. Over £1.1 billion will be a grant, and another £500 million will be seen as a loan. Over the past couple of weeks, of course, passenger numbers have plummeted on the tube and the buses, which has taken away 95% of TfL's revenue. And it doesn't only come from fares, it also comes from advertising. So advertising sales have literally plummeted on big billboards that you would typically see underground and on the big red buses. Now, just last week, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, did say that he would actually have to stop running tubes and buses purely because it would just be, they would be unable to pay for staff. But as we know, this is a key way for key workers to get to work. So the government did last night come up with an agreement. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, he said that this is only a short-term solution. And like I said, he said it will be Londoners, unfortunately, that will have to pay the burden of this and increase fares when the system is back up and running again.
The financial health of one of Scotland's top universities, University of Edinburgh, is under serious threat from the coronavirus pandemic, and it plans for bailout for schools as well.
I doubt that there will be a bailout, but the University of Edinburgh, like other universities like them, are in discussions not only with the UK government, but with the devolved Scottish government. The University of Edinburgh is run like a business model, which most modern universities are. So they do rely heavily on funding that comes from overseas students. Typically, somebody could pay £30,000 a year, and their main students do come from North America and the Far East. Of course, this has stopped. The world is in lockdown. There are no planes coming in and out of UK from that region, and that worries them because their fees are £90 million every month. That's how much they pay out to cover the cost of the university. Also, again, with a university that is run as a business model, they rely heavily on conferences, and conferences are cancelled at the moment. So they have issued this warning, and like I said, I doubt that they'll get a bailout, but they're certainly in discussions with the government of how they can proceed forward and cover some of their costs that they're so rapidly losing.
Meanwhile, Juliana, teachers' unions are to meet the government scientific advisors later as they demand assurances that it will be safe to open schools in England from June. What are some of their concerns?
Well, again, this has been a really major talking point in the UK, and it's become pretty heated, actually. We did hear from some of the leading teachers' unions early in the week, urging some of the schools in England not to talk to the government because they were unhappy that when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, asked people to go back to work, he also mentioned going back to schools, and they believe that they weren't told this. They were completely blindsided, and it's not safe. Schools are supposed to be opening from the 1st of June for pupils of a particular age gap. But the teachers' unions say that schools are not prepared. They haven't been told how they're going to be able to social distance. In fact, can children socially distance? Because, of course, when they're in the playground, what they want to do is play with their friends. And some of those games has to see them constantly touching each other and being with each other. So they said it's not safe. They also want to have PPE, personal protective equipment, for some of the teachers, which the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, says is not available. So they're going to be having these discussions today. And at the moment, they said they are not saying they don't want children to go back to school, because, of course, they do. But they said they want it to be done when they can secure the safety of the children and the teachers.
And safety is always key. Thanks a lot, Juliana. We'll see you again later.
Thank you.
Let's bring things back home at the debt and currencies market, and we'll be speaking with Nkem Adzinge, currencies trader at UBA. Good morning, Nkem. So the adjusted 2020 budget comes with a preferential exchange rate of 360 to the dollar. What sort of signal does that send to the currencies traders like you?
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. Well, we just basically have seen that the CBN has basically opened up, and because of that, we're seeing increased supply in the market. So the increase in the And the volumes traded in the market that we saw yesterday just basically shows that the CBN is beginning to supply to the market. So we just say the signal that we've been getting all for the last week, that once the lockdown, the easing starts to happen, that we'll start seeing rates stabilize more and see things find a more normal level.
Does a 360 to the dollar assumption tell you anything about the possibility of a harmonized FX rates in the near future?
We know that following conversations between the CBN and the IMF, following the loan that we got from the IMF, the conversations has been around the possibility of harmonizing rates. So there have been a few school of thoughts that say that this could be a signal that the CBN might be looking to do that finally. But there are all the school of thoughts that say that it might not just be the right time, so we might see that happen later on. But then there are different school of thoughts to that.
Well, we understand that yesterday the INE FX window saw some improvements in traded volumes. What were the bids like?
Well, we saw bids level mainly between 368 and 387. That's where we saw the range of bids coming around, just those levels.
Okay, just before you go, Nkem, tell us what's your market outlook for today?
Say that again, please.
I was asking, what's your market outlook for today?
Well, market outlook for today, we expect it to be quiet. On the bond space, it's been a sell tone all week, just following the DMO's release of the revised bond auction calendar. So people expect that there will be increased in supply. So we'll probably see yields pick up there. So we expect to still see that selling interest in the bond space. Yesterday, we saw in the almost space that FPIs were buying on the short end while they await the CBN supplying FX to them. So we'll probably still see that from the FPIs. But the Treasury bill market, the fixed income market, remains largely mixed. So we're going to wait to see how the bond auction plays out, because despite the fact that we expect increased supply, the fact that the DMO issued the May circular for the bond auction at 60 billion, we expect that most people will be waiting to see how they're going to borrow more in that space and see how yields play out there. So we're going to keep saying just mixed signals there. In the FX space, we expect that it would still remain quiet. Whilst we saw volumes increase yesterday, we know that it hasn't gone back to where it was. Between the period of January and April, we saw volumes of an average of 300 million being traded daily. So we expect that things will still remain as they are, quiet or calm, and as the CBN continues to supply, we'll steadily see supply levels increase there. Also, we have the expectation of the IMF loan and the World Bank loan coming in. So all of that just gives us the outlook that the CBN would be able to defend the Naira and have rates at a stable rate.
Nkem Mazinge, currency trader at UBA, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us this morning.
Thank you very much.
And just before we go, let's remind you of activities at the crude oil market. Things are actually looking bright at the market this morning. We saw prices, Brent crude actually touching $32 per barrel, and that follows data showing demand for crude picking up in China. Brent crude was up 3.57% at $32.24 a barrel after rising nearly 7% on Thursday. Now, the global benchmark is on course for a 1.8 gain this week. And WTI oil was also up 3.23%, trading at $28.45 a barrel, having jumped 9% in the previous session. And the WTI is heading for a third weekly increase, more than 12%. And amid supply cuts by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and other major producers, bright spots are also emerging on the demand side. The data released today showed that China's daily crude oil use rebounded in April as refineries ramped up operations. And that's where we wrap up today's program. Thank you for watching. I am BC Adebayo. See you next time.